I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Bring a date, your squad, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
The Thames has always shaped Hampton Court. Long before the palace rose above its banks, before kings travelled its waters beneath embroidered canopies, before barges tied up against stone steps, the river was simply the easiest road through southern England. It carried merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, noblemen. It brought trade to the villages along its banks, and it connected places that might otherwise have stayed forgotten. Hampton was one of those places. For centuries, a small riverside manor stood here, orchards, fields, woodland. Close enough to London for convenience, far enough away to escape the noise and the smell of the endless bustle of a growing city. The land belonged to the Knights Hospitaller, and it passed through careful hands, generation after generation. Buildings rose and fell. Nothing suggested that this quiet bend in the river would one day hold one of the great palaces of Europe. Stand there today and you can still feel it. The Thames drifting past exactly as it always has, indifferent to the towers and chimneys that would one day crowd its banks. Then came 1514, and everything changed. Thomas Wolsey's rise should not have been possible. He was the son of an Ipswich butcher. No title, no inheritance. Nothing to recommend him but his own mind. And yet he climbed higher than any commoner in England had climbed before him. Henry VIII trusted him absolutely. Ambassadors courted his favour, nearly as eager as they courted the king's. It was said that nothing happened in England without first passing through Wolsey's hands. A man like that needed a setting to match his power. So when Wolsey took Hampton Court, he didn't build a country house, he built a statement. Hundreds of craftsmen arrived. Brickmakers worked without rest. Barges brought timber down the Thames, while stone came in from distant quarries. And from dawn until dusk, the estate rang with hammers. Slowly, the old manor vanished beneath something England had never quite seen before. Red brick glowing in afternoon light. Chimneys twisted like sculpture against the sky. Room after room, each richer than the last. Tapestries, painted ceilings, stained glass scattering colour across the floors. Ambassadors carried word of it back across Europe. Some whispered that a churchman's palace had begun to rival a king's. That was the trouble. Henry loved Hampton Court. He hunted its forests, filled its halls with feasting, and for years every visit seemed to draw minister and monarch closer. Then Henry decided he wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon undone. And Wolsey, tasked with making it happen, spent months negotiating with Rome and getting nowhere. Henry's patience curdled into suspicion. The man who had stood closer to the throne than anyone else suddenly found he was standing alone. By the autumn of 1529, Wolsey handed Hampton Court to the king, hoping the gift might buy back his favour. It didn't. Stripped of his office, accused of treason, he died on the road back to London before he ever reached a trial. The palace stayed standing, it always does. It's one of history's small ironies that the building outlasted the man, far more completely than his power ever did. People remember Hampton Court. Almost no one remembers that every brick of it began as one disgraced man's ambition. Henry made the palace his own and went further than Wolsey ever did. Courtyards grew, kitchens multiplied. New lodgings appeared for nobles, for servants, for foreign guests, until Hampton Court was no longer just a royal residence. It was the beating heart of Tudor government. Picture it, several hundred people living under one roof at any given time, sometimes swelling to thousands for a great occasion. Fires roaring beneath the roasting hearths, bakers and brewers and pastry cooks working without pause. Fresh fish from the Thames, venison from the royal forests, spices carried from the far side of the known world. And beneath all that noise, a rigid order. Every doorway meant something. Every room had its rank. The closer you stood to the king's private apartments, the fewer people were allowed anywhere near you. And a man's whole career might rise or fall on how many doors separated him from Henry himself. Nowhere captures that world better than the Great Hall. It's still there today, its hammer beam roof arching high over the tables below. Music once echoed through these rafters, while courtiers traded gossip that would alter the fate of kingdoms. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor through stained glass. Every banquet celebrated something. A victory, an alliance, a marriage. And every smile in the room hid some private ambition. Hampton Court could make a man. It could also very quietly destroy one. No one understood that better than Henry's queens. Jane Seymour arrived at Hampton Court without Anne Boleyn's brilliance, and without Catherine of Aragon's decades of political weight behind her. She was quiet. She didn't try to dominate the court the way the others had. What Henry wanted from her was different. Stability after years of turmoil, and above all, the son he had spent his whole reign trying to father. By the autumn of 1537, the palace was holding its breath. Jane went into labour in her apartments. It lasted hours. Outside her chamber, courtiers waited in silence, so tense you could feel the whole future of the Tudor dynasty pressing against those closed doors. Then the news broke, and it broke like sunlight. A son, Prince Edward. Bells rang out, bonfires were lit. Messengers rode out from Hampton Court, carrying word across England. Henry finally had his heir. After 2 broken marriages and a religious revolution to get him. For a few days, the palace knew nothing but celebration. Then quietly, it stopped. Jane's condition began to turn. What had looked like a triumphant birth became a slow, desperate fight, and the sound in the palace changed with it. Doors that had banged open now opened softly. Voices dropped to whispers, and the people who had lit bonfires only days before now simply waited, helpless, as the finest physicians in England failed her. On the 24th of October 1537, Jane Seymour died inside the same palace that had just witnessed Henry's greatest triumph. The bells that had rung for a new prince now rang for his mother. Of all Henry's wives, she is the one buried beside him at Windsor, and for Hampton Court, her death marked something new. The first time its wars had absorbed real grief, rather than simply ambition and celebration. People would remember that autumn for centuries. The rooms where England got its long-awaited prince, and only days later, the rooms where his mother quietly stopped breathing. Henry buried his grief in work, because the machinery of a kingdom doesn't stop for mourning. Councillors kept meeting, Ambassadors kept arriving, but everyone who lived inside those walls would have remembered how fast the celebration of October 1537 curdled into silence. 4 years later, the palace saw it happen again. Catherine Howard was barely more than a girl when she became Henry's fifth wife. Lively, where Jane had been quiet; youthful, where Henry was aging badly. And for a while, she brought something like joy back to a court that had grown grey and sombre. Henry adored her. Music and feasting returned to Hampton Court. It didn't last. Rumours had circulated, even before the marriage, but while Catherine held the king's favour, nobody dared act on them. Slowly, though, whispers hardened into evidence. Archbishop Cranmer began quietly gathering testimony about relationships Catherine had hidden from Henry. Witnesses were questioned. Letters changed hands. And through it all, Henry knew nothing. Then one November afternoon in 1541, while the king was at prayer in the Chapel Royal, the evidence finally reached him. Those close to the court said he was devastated. The young queen who had restored his happiness now stood accused of betraying him entirely. And this is where the story leaves the historical record and enters folklore. There is a long gallery at Hampton Court, lined with portraits, its tall windows looking out over the gardens, the kind of corridor that seems built for echoes. For nearly 5 centuries, the story attached to it has been this: that on hearing she would never see Henry again as his queen, Catherine broke free from her guards and ran, screaming, down that gallery toward the chapel where he knelt at Mass, hoping that if she could only reach him, he might yet forgive her. She never made it. She was caught and dragged away before she came anywhere near the chapel door, and her cries are said to have echoed through the palace until they finally died out. Historians will tell you the documented record confirms her disgrace and her arrest at Hampton Court, but that desperate run down the gallery belongs to memory, not to any surviving document. It's exactly the kind of story a great building gathers to itself over time. One moment retold often enough, that eventually becomes inseparable from the place itself. They call it the Haunted Gallery now. Catherine was taken from the palace under guard and executed at the Tower of London the following February. She was probably no older than 19. Henry himself never really recovered his old spirit. The tournaments and the hunting parties faded, and the confident king who had built so much of Hampton Court gave way to failing health and a slow retreat into isolation. He died in 1547. The Tudors kept using the palace, if never quite with the same intensity. Elizabeth I returned often, and under the Stuarts, Hampton Court kept finding itself at the centre of things that mattered far beyond its own walls. In 1604, James I gathered bishops and scholars here for the conference that eventually produced the King James Bible, a book whose influence would stretch across centuries and continents. Then came civil war, and by 1647, the palace held a different kind of resident. A king who was no longer its master, but its prisoner. Charles I lived out several months at Hampton Court under guard, walking gardens that concealed the reality of his captivity before slipping away one night in a bid for freedom. It bought him almost nothing. Within 2 years, he was tried and executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Another monarch outlived by the palace he thought he controlled. Oliver Cromwell, oddly enough, is one of the reasons Hampton Court still stands. While plenty of royal buildings were left to rot or torn down under the Commonwealth. Cromwell found practical use for this one and kept it intact. By the time William III and Mary II took the throne in 1689, the old Tudor palace no longer looked the part for European royalty, and William brought in Sir Christopher Wren to remake it entirely. Wren's ambitions were enormous. Grand Baroque state apartments in pale stone meant to sweep away most of what Wolsey and Henry had built, but the money ran out. Priorities shifted, and William died before the work was finished. That unfinished project is the palace we still have. Tudor brick meeting Baroque stone, one doorway opening into the 16th century, the next into the 17th. Every generation adding something, and none of them quite managing to erase what came before. By the 18th century, royal court life had largely moved elsewhere, and Hampton Court fell quiet. Its vast apartments, once filled with ambassadors and musicians, were instead handed out as grace and favour homes to retired officers, to widows, to servants of the crown who'd earned the king's gratitude. The palace didn't empty out. It just became lived in a much smaller, much quieter way. Families slept in rooms where kings once had. Children ran through corridors that had watched the whole of Tudor politics unfold, without giving any of it a second thought. And it was in that quieter, slower century that Hampton Court began to earn a very different kind of reputation. The palace settled into a quieter life. The noise of the Tudor court faded into memory, replaced by something altogether more ordinary. The grand apartments were no longer filled with ambassadors, musicians, and noblemen competing for the king's attention. Instead, retired soldiers, widows, artists, and loyal servants of the crown found themselves living in rooms where monarchs had once slept. Children played in courtyards where history had been made. Washing hung from windows that had once overlooked royal processions. Hampton Court had not become a ruin or a museum. It had simply become a place where people lived their lives beneath the weight of an extraordinary past. Yet the past has a habit of making itself known. Old buildings are rarely silent. Timber shifts as temperatures change. Stone carries sound in strange ways. Wind slips through passages opened and closed by generations of rebuilding. At Hampton Court, those familiar sounds often seem to become something else after dark. Residents spoke of footsteps where no one could be found, voices that faded as they were approached, and the uneasy feeling that someone had just turned a corner ahead of them. One woman, though, seemed to belong there more than any other. Sybil Penn had spent her life at the Tudor court. She cared for the young Edward VI, and later nursed Elizabeth I through the smallpox that almost claimed the future queen's life. In doing so, she caught the disease herself and died in 1562, remembered by a few beyond those she had faithfully served. Centuries later, repairs disturbed her grave in the nearby church. Not long afterwards, people living inside Hampton Court began speaking quietly of an elderly woman dressed in grey. She appeared without drama, walking calmly through the palace, as though still carrying out duties she had never abandoned. No one described her as frightening. If anything, witnesses seemed reluctant to disturb her. Then came a second mystery. Night after night, somewhere within the walls, came a steady turning of a spinning wheel. The sound grew so persistent that builders eventually searched for its source and uncovered an old spinning wheel concealed within the building's own fabric. Finding it answered one question. It raised another. Why had it started turning again after so many silent years? The palace offered no explanation. It rarely does. Climb a little higher through Hampton Court, and another part of its history begins to press against the present. The Silverstick Stairs get far less attention than the Great Hall or the State Apartments, yet they hold a stillness that feels entirely their own. As daylight fades, the shadows gather there quickly. It's easy to see why generations have paused before continuing upward. More than once, people have described a woman carrying a single candle. She moves slowly, her face lit by its small flame, never looking toward whoever is watching her. There is no panic in her, no attempt to speak, only a deep sadness. By the time anyone finds the courage to follow, she's gone. The figure has become inseparable from Jane Seymour, whose greatest happiness and deepest tragedy unfolded within these walls only days apart. Whether she truly walks those stairs or not, her story is never far away. Not every memory stays so quiet. The long gallery leading toward the Chapel Royal carries an altogether different atmosphere. By day, it's bright and elegant, its windows overlooking the gardens, while portraits watch from the walls with unreadable expressions. Once the palace empties, though, the gallery feels much longer than it looks. Every footstep seems to travel ahead of you before fading into silence. A palace warden making his evening rounds once heard footsteps behind him, quick ones closing the distance. He turned. The gallery was empty. Another member of staff later heard a woman crying somewhere beyond the walls. Believing someone had been locked in after closing, colleagues searched every nearby room, staircase, and passage. They found no one. The crying stopped as suddenly as it had begun. By then, everyone who worked at Hampton Court already knew the story attached to that gallery. Catherine Howard's desperate attempt to reach Henry before she was taken away for the last time. Whether the old story shapes what people experience there, or the experiences simply keep the story alive, is impossible to say. The gallery and Catherine Howard have long since become part of each other. Even beneath the courtyards, Hampton Court sometimes seems reluctant to let its past go. During building work in Fountain Court in the 19th century, labourers uncovered 2 human skeletons beneath the paving. No record identified them or explained why they'd been laid there. The find drew particular attention because a woman living nearby had complained for years of persistent knocking beneath her rooms, the same tapping every night in the same place. Once the remains were carefully removed and reburied elsewhere, the knocking was never heard again. Then, in the autumn of 2003, Hampton Court made headlines once more. Security staff reviewing routine CCTV footage noticed that a heavy fire door had been swinging open on its own for several nights running. On one recording, a broad-shouldered figure appeared in the doorway, stood perfectly still for a few moments, and disappeared from view. The footage spread quickly, and the arguments about it have never really settled. Some see nothing more than an odd trick of camera angle, lighting, and costume. Others see someone entirely at home inside a palace where 5 centuries still sit side by side. Hampton Court has never tried to answer those questions. It simply carries on, as it always has. That, more than anything else, is what defines Hampton Court. Its stories are never loud. They don't ask to be believed. They exist simply because the palace has absorbed so much human experience over 500 years that history and memory have started to occupy the same rooms. As the last visitors drift out through the gates each evening, the Thames keeps moving past exactly as it did when Wolsey watched the first barges of stone arrive. It flowed past Henry's windows, It carried the news of Edward's birth away from the palace, and only days later, the news of his mother's death. It has reflected the torchlight of guards chasing an escaped king, and the quiet lamplight of generations of residents who called these rooms home. The river remembers nothing. The palace remembers everything. Every coronation and every execution. Every dynasty that believed itself untouchable, and every one that Hampton Court quietly outlived. Its stories are woven so deeply into the brick and stone by now that pulling history apart from memory may no longer be possible. When the gates close and the last footsteps fade, Hampton Court returns to itself, keeping its own counsel in the dark, just as it has for more than 500 years. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and leave a rating or review. It really does help more people discover the show. You can find more online at ghosttales.co.uk. You can support the podcast and gain access to exclusive content at www.buymeacoffee.com/ghosttales.